water glass felt slick in my palm, condensation bleeding through my fingers like the courage I was forcing myself to hold on to. The Grand Royal Hotel ballroom pulsed with orchestral strings and the murmur of wealth, but all I could hear was the hollow thud of my heartbeat as I saw him through the crowd. Austin, my ex-boyfriend, stood beneath the crystal chandelier near the silent auction display, his hand gesturing animatedly as he held court with men in $1,000 watches. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. 4 years had passed since he'd destroyed me, since he'd told me I was bad for his image, that my struggles made him look weak to his colleagues. 4 years since I'd stood in the apartment we'd shared, watching him check his phone while I packed boxes of my life into my rust-stained sedan. He'd leaned against the doorframe that day, arms crossed, his expression somewhere between boredom and relief. When I'd asked him to help me carry the heavier boxes down 3 flights of stairs, he'd looked at me like I'd asked him to carry garbage. "You're a grown woman, Vanessa," he'd said. "Figure it out." And I had. I'd figured out a lot of things after that. Like how the debt my father supposedly left me wasn't actually debt at all. Like how the apartment building I'd lost to foreclosure had been stolen, not surrendered. Like how the medical diagnosis that had made me believe I was broken had been a lie purchased for $10,000. The ballroom's air conditioning raised goosebumps along my bare arms, but I couldn't tell if it was the chill or the nausea climbing up my throat. I'd come tonight because the invitation had arrived at my door, plain cream cardstock with no return address. Someone wanted me here. The irony wasn't lost on me. I wasn't running from my past. I was standing in its center, exposed. I turned toward the service corridor, my white dress, a simple sheath I'd found at a boutique closing sale, suddenly feeling paper-thin compared to the sequined gowns surrounding me. The scent of Casablanca lilies mixed with champagne made my head swim. Vanessa Morgan. I froze. My maiden name. He didn't know. Of course he didn't know. Forcing my expression into something resembling composure, I turned. Austin approached with that familiar arrogance, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. His cologne, still that same designer brand he'd always worn, hit me like a slap, dragging back memories of ultimatums and accusations. "I thought that was you," he said, his gaze raking over me from head to toe in a way that made my skin prickle. Not with interest, with assessment, like I was something he'd discarded and was now checking to see if it had appreciated in value. Wow. Still dressing modest, I see. The way he said it told me everything. He meant cheap. "Austin," I managed, keeping my voice level. "A small victory in a war I hadn't known I'd be fighting tonight." He gestured to a tall woman beside him, draped in designer labels and dripping with diamonds. "My fiancé. We're getting married at the plaza next spring. Destination wedding in Tuscany." The woman extended her hand, and the ring on her finger could have funded a small hospital wing. Fitting, considering we were supposed to be raising money for sick children tonight. "Congratulations," I murmured, the word catching in my dry throat. "And you?" The woman's voice carried that particular brand of curiosity that barely masked contempt. "Are you here with someone? I don't see a +1 on your name tag." Before I could answer, Austin laughed. That same condescending sound I remembered from arguments about my job, my clothes, my friends, my family's financial troubles. "No husband yet? Nessie?" He used the nickname like a weapon. "Still waiting to get your act together?" The words found their mark. I felt heat flood my face, my hands clenching around the glass. Around us, donors and socialites continued their conversations, oblivious to my humiliation. The ballroom's ornate walls suddenly felt like they were pressing in, the champagne tower beside me threatening to topple. "Actually," I started, but Austin was already talking over me. He'd always been good at that, making sure my voice disappeared beneath his. "You know, I always wondered how you'd end up," he continued, and I could see Catherine trying to hide a smirk behind her champagne flute. "You were always so resistant to help. I tried to show you how to present yourself, how to network, but," he shrugged, as if my entire existence had been a charity project he'd wisely abandoned. "Some women just never learn their place." That last sentence hung in the air like poison gas. Something inside me cracked. Maybe it was the way he stood there, so certain of my failure. Maybe it was the 4 years of rebuilding myself, of clawing my way out of the pit he'd thrown me into. of learning to stand without anyone's pity, only to have him try to crush me again with a few casual words delivered in a room full of strangers. But before I could respond, something changed. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. The conversations around us didn't stop, but they quieted, as if everyone had suddenly become aware of a predator in their midst. Austin didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying his own cruelty, but his fiancée noticed. Her eyes widened slightly, looking past my shoulder. The scent hit me first. Sandalwood and leather, expensive and dark, cutting through the lilies and champagne like a blade. Then came the warmth. A presence at my back, solid and unmovable. A large hand, marked with dark tattoos that crawled past the cuff of an immaculate white shirt, settled on my shoulder. The heat of his palm burned through the thin fabric of my dress. "Breathe, amore." A voice murmured against my ear, low and deadly. "I'm here." I didn't need to turn around. I knew that voice. I knew those hands. I knew the man who'd sent me the invitation, who'd been watching from the VIP balcony, waiting for exactly this moment. Austin's smirk faltered. His eyes traveled up and up to the man standing behind me, and I watched the color drain from his face like water from a broken glass. "You're speaking," Antonio said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an avalanche, to Mrs. Alessandro. The denial came quickly, desperately. Austin let out a nervous laugh that didn't quite land, the sound hollow against the sudden quiet that had descended over our corner of the ballroom. "Mrs. Alessandro?" He forced another laugh, louder this time, trying to reclaim the confidence that had been draining from his face. "Please, Nessie. We both know you can barely afford cab fare, let alone a marriage license." He looked to his fiancée for support, for validation, but she had taken a small step backward, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. The silence around us wasn't normal. It wasn't the polite hush of people trying not to eavesdrop. It was the kind of silence that came from primal instinct, from the small animal part of the brain that recognized a predator even before the conscious mind caught up. I could feel it radiating from the man behind me. Danger. Not the threat of violence, but the promise of it, the certainty of it. The conversations in our immediate vicinity had died completely. People were still talking across the ballroom, still laughing near the bar. But here, in this pocket of space, everything had gone still. The scent of sandalwood and leather intensified as Antonio shifted, and beneath it I caught something else. Something metallic and sharp, like the air before a lightning strike. It cut through the sweet, cloying perfume of the lilies that decorated every surface of the ballroom. The heat of his hand on my shoulder was anchoring me, keeping me upright when every instinct told me to run. Not from him, never from him, but from this moment, from the confrontation I'd spent 4 years both dreading and craving. I watched Austin's eyes track upward as Antonio straightened to his full height behind me, 6'4" of controlled power. The hand on my shoulder lifted, and I heard the rustle of expensive fabric as he moved. Then he was beside me, and I could finally see what everyone else was seeing, what was making Catherine's face go pale, what was making Austin's swagger crumble like wet paper. Antonio Alessandro didn't walk into spaces. He owned them the moment he decided to. He'd been standing in the shadows near the VIP pillars, watching, waiting. Now he moved through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea, except the people who stumbled out of his way weren't moved by faith. They were moved by fear, by recognition, by the kind of self-preservation that told them to get out of the way of something infinitely more dangerous than they could ever hope to be. His suit was black, perfectly tailored to accommodate the broad shoulders and lean muscle beneath, but it was the skin that drew the eye. Dark ink crawled up his neck from beneath his collar, intricate patterns that looked like they told stories written in violence and blood. More tattoos marked his hands, the kind you couldn't hide in polite society, the kind that said he didn't care about polite society. A skull bloomed across his right knuckles. Symbols I didn't fully understand decorated the backs of his hands, disappearing beneath the crisp white cuffs of his shirt. This wasn't the ink of rebellion or fashion. This was the ink of belonging, of warning, of a world that existed in the shadows of the city, where men like Austin played at power, while men like Antonio held it absolutely. He had a scar along his jawline, thin and precise, the kind left by a blade wielded with intent. His dark hair was swept back from his face, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes that looked black in the ballroom light. Those eyes weren't looking at the crowd that had parted for him. They weren't looking at the chandeliers or the auction displays or the charity banners proclaiming tonight's noble cause. They were looking at me. Only me. Like I was the only person in the room who mattered. Like I was the only person in the world who mattered. He stopped beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that his scent wrapped around me like armor. His hand returned to my shoulder, and this time I could see it, could see the tattoos that marked him as something other than the civilized men in their designer tuxedos, could see the barely controlled strength in the way his fingers curved against the white fabric of my dress. The touch was possessive, protective, proprietary. It burned through the thin material like a brand, and I found myself leaning into it instead of away. "Who's this?" Austin's voice had lost its edge, replaced by something that tried to sound amused but came out uncertain. "Your driver? Security?" He looked around, trying to find someone who would laugh with him, trying to reclaim the audience he'd had when he was busy humiliating me, but the people who'd been close enough to hear his cruel remarks had melted away. The socialites who'd watched my humiliation with barely concealed glee were suddenly very interested in their champagne, in the silent auction, in anything that wasn't this confrontation. Antonio didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge that Austin had spoken. Instead, he leaned down, bringing his mouth close to my ear. His breath was warm against my skin, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only I could hear. "Breathe, amore." The Italian endearment rolled off his tongue like honey and smoke. "I'm here, and God help me I did breathe." For the first time since I'd heard Austin call my maiden name, I felt like I could pull air into my lungs without it hurting. Then Antonio straightened, and his eyes, those dead, cold, merciless eyes, finally turned to Austin. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "You are speaking," Antonio said, his voice quiet, controlled, and absolutely terrifying in its calm, "to Mrs. Alessandro." Austin's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like pity, that condescending expression I knew so well, the one that said he thought I was lying to save face. "Mrs. Alessandro," he repeated, shaking his head with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Right. Of course you are." He turned to his fiancée, who was still standing frozen beside him. She always did have an active imagination, used to make up stories about her family having money before her father died. It was sad, really. The lie was so casual, so practiced, that for a moment I almost believed he believed it. But I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was already spinning this in his mind, already figuring out how to use my supposed delusion as another example of why he'd been right to leave me. Another story to tell at cocktail parties about the unstable ex-girlfriend who couldn't accept reality. Antonio's hand left my shoulder, and I felt the loss of that heat immediately, but then his fingers found mine, wrapping around my left hand with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about him. He lifted my hand slowly, deliberately, raising it until the ballroom lights caught the ring on my fourth finger. The diamond flashed, throwing prisms of light across Austin's face. It was massive, easily 5 carats, set in a band that looked black in the chandelier glow. I'd worn it for 8 months now, but I still wasn't used to the weight of it, still wasn't used to what it meant. "She can't afford a cab," Austin said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. He was staring at the ring now, and I could see him trying to do the math in his head, trying to figure out if it was real, if it was paste, if this was some elaborate trick I'd pulled to embarrass him. Let alone a marriage license, let alone a ring like that. It's probably cubic zirconia from some mall kiosk. Antonio's grip on my hand tightened fractionally. Not enough to hurt, but enough that I felt the controlled strength in his fingers. He angled my hand, tilting it so the light caught the band differently. That's when I saw Austin's expression change, really change, because the band wasn't just black gold, it was engraved. Intricate symbols carved into the metal, ancient and unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The crest of the Camorra, a skull wrapped in laurel leaves, crossed keys beneath it, all rendered in such fine detail that it could only have been done by a master craftsman. This wasn't jewelry you bought in a store. This was jewelry you inherited, or earned, or received as a declaration of ownership and protection. "Do you know what this seal means, Mr. Payne?" Antonio's voice was soft, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He wasn't asking a question. He was delivering a verdict. "In my world, this isn't jewelry. It's a warning." He paused, letting the words settle into the space between them. "It's a kill order on anyone who disrespects the wearer." The color drained from Austin's face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. His hand, the one that had been gesturing so confidently moments ago, dropped to his side. His fiancée made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, and took another step back. She knew. Even if Austin had been oblivious, she knew. The Alessandro name wasn't whispered in polite society, but it was whispered everywhere else. In the back rooms of City Hall, in the private offices of banks, in the places where real power was brokered and bought. Antonio Alessandro owned half the city's infrastructure. The other half paid him tribute to exist. Austin started, then stopped. His throat worked as he swallowed. I wasn't. For the first time since I'd known him, Austin Payne was at a loss for words. The man who'd always had a quick comeback, always had a way to twist the conversation back in his favor, was floundering. I watched him try to recalibrate, try to find solid ground in a situation that had just become quicksand beneath his feet. Then something shifted in his expression. Desperation, maybe, or pride too wounded to admit defeat. He straightened, pulling his shoulders back, and I recognized the defensive posture, the one he used when he was about to bluff his way through something he didn't understand. "I don't care who you are," he said, and his voice was too loud, too forced. Several people nearby turned to look. "I'm the general manager of this hotel. This is my gala, my event, and you're disrupting it." Antonio released my hand, but not before pressing his lips to my knuckles in a gesture that was somehow more intimate than a kiss on the mouth. Then he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Austin. The height difference was dramatic. Austin was maybe 5'10", average build. Antonio towered over him, and the tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse in the light, alive with threat. "Your gala," Antonio repeated, his tone almost amused. "Your event." He looked around the ballroom as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the marble floors, the gilded molding that probably cost more than most people's houses. Interesting choice of words. He returned his gaze to Austin, and there was something predatory in his eyes now. Something that made me think of wolves circling wounded prey. "Tell me, Mr. Payne, do you know who owns this hotel?" Austin's jaw tightened. "The Grand Royal Hotel is owned by Meridian Luxury Properties. I manage the flagship location. I've worked here for 6 years, and I've never heard of anyone named Alessandro having any connection to this property." But there was uncertainty creeping into his voice now, a tremor of doubt that he couldn't quite hide. "Meridian Luxury Properties," Antonio said, nodding slowly. "That's correct. Or rather, it was correct." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, and Austin flinched. Actually flinched, as if he expected a weapon. But what Antonio pulled out was a single folded document, thick paper that looked official even from where I stood. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Meridian Luxury Properties and all its holdings, including this hotel and the 6 others in the chain, were purchased by Alessandro Enterprises. He held up the document, and I could see signatures, legal stamps, the kind of paperwork that represented millions of dollars changing hands. "So you see, Mr. Payne, this isn't your gala anymore. You're not the general manager anymore." His smile was razor sharp. "You're trespassing on my property." Austin's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. That's impossible. I would have been notified. Corporate would have called me. There are procedures, protocols." His voice was climbing in pitch, the careful control he'd maintained throughout his mockery of me completely shattered. "You can't just buy a hotel chain in a few hours. That's not how it works." "It is when you pay enough," Antonio said simply. He turned his head slightly, not looking away from Austin, but addressing someone beyond my line of sight. "Mr. Garrison, would you join us, please?" I heard footsteps, expensive shoes on marble, and then a man in his 60s appeared at Antonio's side. He wore a charcoal suit and carried himself with the kind of authority that came from decades of wielding power. I recognized him vaguely from photos in the business section of the newspaper. Leonard Garrison, CEO of Meridian Luxury Properties, or former CEO, apparently. "Mr. Payne," Garrison said, and his voice was clipped, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. "I apologize that you weren't informed earlier, but the sale was finalized quite rapidly. Alessandro Enterprises made an offer we couldn't refuse, and all paperwork was expedited. As of 0900 hours this morning, you are no longer employed by Meridian. Your termination paperwork will be delivered to your residence tomorrow." The ballroom had gone completely silent now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, though I couldn't remember when. Everyone was watching. The donors, the socialites, the people who'd paid thousands of dollars to attend this charity gala were getting dinner and a show. Austin's public execution, served alongside champagne and hors d'oeuvres. "You can't fire me," Austin said, but the words had no strength behind them. "I have a contract. I have 3 years left on my contract. My lawyers will." "Your contract included a morality clause," Garrison interrupted, "which you violated approximately 17 times over the past 6 months. Mr. Alessandro's people were very thorough in documenting your infractions. You're lucky he's only firing you. He could have you arrested." Garrison nodded once to Antonio, a gesture of deference that made it clear who held the real power in this conversation, and then he melted back into the crowd. Austin looked like he'd been physically struck. His face had gone from pale to red, blotchy with humiliation and rage. His hands were shaking. His fiancée had disappeared entirely. I realized I hadn't seen her in the past minute. She'd abandoned him the moment his power evaporated, like the opportunist she clearly was. "This is harassment," Austin said, his voice breaking. This is some kind of vendetta. You're using your money to bully me because she," he pointed at me, his finger trembling, "because she probably fed you some sob story about how I broke her heart. Women like her always play the victim." Something dangerous flickered in Antonio's eyes, the kind of danger that made me grateful I'd never been on the receiving end of his displeasure. "Careful," he said softly. "You're about to say something that will ensure you leave this hotel on a stretcher instead of on your feet." Movement caught my attention. 2 security guards were approaching from the direction of the main entrance, their hands hovering near their belts where radios and other equipment hung. But as they got closer, within 10 feet of our group, they slowed, then stopped. I could see the recognition dawn on their faces. They knew who Antonio was. More importantly, they knew what he was. One of them, the older guard with gray at his temples, actually took a step backward. The other guard, younger and clearly less experienced, looked confused. "Sir," he said, addressing Austin but keeping his eyes on Antonio. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes, there's a problem," Austin said, desperation making him reckless. "This man is trespassing. He's threatening me. I want him removed from the premises immediately. Both of them." He gestured at Antonio and me, lumping us together as if we were equally offensive. "Call the police. Tell them we have a situation." The older guard cleared his throat. "Mr. Payne, I think there's been some confusion. Mr. Alessandro is the new owner of the hotel. We received notification from corporate this afternoon. He's not trespassing." "You are." The words were delivered gently, almost apologetically, but they landed like bombs. The younger guard's hand had moved away from his belt entirely. Neither of them looked like they had any intention of touching Antonio. Smart men. Austin's breathing was ragged now. I could see his chest rising and falling too quickly. I could see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. He was cornered, stripped of his authority, his reputation crumbling in real time in front of everyone he'd tried to impress. And like any cornered animal, he was about to lash out. I could see it building in him, the rage and humiliation coalescing into something ugly. He spun around, looking frantically through the crowd, and then his face lit with something like hope. "Baby!" he shouted. "Babe, call the police. Tell them he's harassing us. Tell them he's making threats." But his fiancée was gone. I scanned the ballroom and spotted her near the exit, her designer clutch tucked under her arm, already halfway out the door. She didn't look back, didn't acknowledge him. She'd made her calculation and decided Austin Payne wasn't worth her time anymore. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered every cruel word he'd said to me tonight, every humiliation he'd inflicted, every time he'd made me feel small and worthless and less than human. My sympathy evaporated like morning dew under a brutal sun. Austin's voice cracked as he called after her. He started to move toward her, but Antonio's hand shot out, gripping Austin's shoulder and stopping him cold. It wasn't a hard grip, but it was immovable. "She's gone, Mr. Payne," Antonio said. "She's been gone for months. You just didn't know it." Austin froze, turned slowly to face Antonio. "What are you talking about?" And then I saw her, the woman who'd been standing in the shadows near the bar, watching everything unfold with cool, professional detachment. She was tall, stunning, with dark hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore a black dress that looked expensive but understated. And as she walked toward us, I saw Austin's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and then pure, abject horror. "Hello, Austin," she said, her voice pleasant, almost friendly. "I believe we need to talk about those charity funds you've been skimming." Austin stared at the woman approaching us, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to name. He looked confused, uncertain. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Austin. My name is Jordan Hayes. I'm a forensic accountant with Alessandro Enterprises." She stopped a few feet away from Antonio, and I watched her reach into the slim black clutch she'd been carrying all evening. Austin was still trying to process, still trying to understand. "What are you talking about? You're my fiancé. We're engaged. We've been together for 8 months. We're getting married in the spring." Jordan's hand emerged from the clutch, but she wasn't holding a phone. She was holding a thick manila folder, the kind that holds dozens of pages, the kind that holds evidence. She extended it toward Antonio, who took it with a nod that suggested this had all been choreographed long before tonight. "The audit is complete, sir," Jordan said, her voice professional and detached, as if she were discussing quarterly reports instead of destroying a man's entire life. "Every transaction is documented. Every penny he siphoned from the charity accounts over the past 18 months. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the falsified donation records. It's all in there." The air went out of the ballroom. I felt it, a collective intake of breath from everyone close enough to hear. These were donors, people who'd written checks tonight believing their money was going to sick children, to medical research, to something good and pure. And now they were learning that the man who'd been soliciting their generosity had been stealing from the very cause he claimed to champion. Antonio opened the folder, scanning the contents with an expression that revealed nothing. But I could feel the satisfaction radiating from him, subtle and dark. This was what he'd been waiting for. Not just to humiliate Austin, but to destroy him completely. To dismantle every piece of the life Austin had built on lies and stolen money and cruelty. "You've been working for him?" Austin's voice had gone hollow, disbelieving. He looked at Jordan like she was a stranger, which I supposed she was. Had always been. The entire time? Everything we did? You were just, what? Spying on me? Jordan's expression didn't change. "I wasn't spying, Austin. I was investigating. There's a difference. Mr. Alessandro hired me 6 months ago, after certain financial irregularities came to light. You've been siphoning money from the Angels of Mercy charity fund since you took over management of the gala 2 years ago. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there, but you got greedy. This year alone, you've stolen nearly $200,000 from donations meant for children's cancer research." The words landed like physical blows. Austin stumbled backward, his hand reaching for a nearby cocktail table to steady himself. Around us, the crowd had grown. More people were drifting closer, drawn by the spectacle. I could see phones coming out, cameras turning on. This wasn't just going to ruin Austin tonight. This was going to follow him forever. Digital immortality of the worst kind. Austin started, but his voice cracked. "That's not. You can't prove any of that. You're lying. He's paying you to lie." Antonio closed the folder with a soft sound that somehow carried through the ballroom. "Bank transfers don't lie, Mr. Payne. Wire records don't lie. The Cayman Islands account in your mother's maiden name doesn't lie." He handed the folder to one of the security guards, who took it like it might explode. "But please, continue to deny it. I find watching liars trapped by their own words deeply satisfying." Austin's face had gone red again, blotchy with rage and shame. I could see the exact moment he realized there was no way out of this. No clever words or charming deflection would save him. Jordan, or Catherine, or whatever her real name was, had been in his life for months, had probably shared his bed, had definitely shared his secrets, and every moment had been a performance designed to gather evidence. "You slept with me," Austin said, and there was something pathetic in his voice now, something broken. "We were together. How could you do that if you were just using me?" Jordan's smile was thin and sharp as a razor. "I'm very good at my job, Austin. Mr. Alessandro pays well for thorough work." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I found myself almost feeling sorry for Austin again. Almost. Then I remembered the woman standing beside him earlier wasn't Jordan. It was Catherine, which meant there had been 2 women. I blinked, confused, trying to piece together what I'd missed. Antonio must have seen my confusion because he leaned close, his voice low in my ear. "Jordan has been posing as his fiancée for 6 months. She's been documenting everything. He never suspected a thing. The calculation of it, the sheer planning required, made my head spin. How long had Antonio been watching Austin? How many pieces had he put in motion? And why? Why go to such elaborate lengths to destroy a man who was, in the grand scheme of things, nobody? Just a mid-level hotel manager with delusions of grandeur. Unless it wasn't about Austin at all. Unless it had always been about me. Austin's gaze swung to me, and I saw the exact moment he reached the same conclusion. "This is because of her," he said, pointing at me with a shaking hand. "You're doing all of this because of her. Because she what? Told you I was mean to her? Told you I broke her heart?" His laugh was ugly, desperate. She was a charity case. I tried to help her, tried to make something of her, and she fought me every step of the way. She was drowning in debt when I met her, completely lost after her father died. I gave her a place to live, tried to teach her how to present herself. And this is how she repays me? By setting her rich husband on me? The lies came so easily to him, so naturally, that I wondered if he actually believed them. If he'd rewritten our history so many times in his head that he no longer remembered the truth. That he'd stolen from me. That he'd gaslit me. That he'd deliberately destroyed what little I had left after my father's death and convinced me it was my own fault. Antonio's hand found my waist, pulling me closer to him. The gesture was possessive, protective, and it gave me strength I didn't know I needed. "Careful," Antonio said again, his voice dropping to a register that made the security guards take another step back. "You're about to say something that will make me forget we're in public." But Austin was past caring, past thinking. Stripped of his job, his reputation, his freedom, he had nothing left to lose. And that made him dangerous in a different way. "She told you she was drowning in debt, didn't she?" he said, his voice climbing. "Did she tell you why? Did she tell you about her father's gambling? About the loans he took out that she inherited? Did she tell you she's broken? That she can't even give you children?" The words hit me like ice water. My breath caught in my throat. Antonio's hand tightened on my waist. "That's enough," he said. But Austin was already reaching into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. "I have proof," Austin said, his fingers swiping across the screen frantically. "Medical records. From her doctor. She's infertile. Damaged. I left her because she couldn't give me a legacy, and she knows it. She's always known it." The words hung in the air like a curse. Barren, damaged, dead end. Every syllable was designed to cut, to bleed me, to reduce me to the smallest, most broken version of myself. And God help me, they worked. For a moment, I was back in that doctor's office 3.5 years ago, sitting on the crinkly paper of the examination table, while a man in a white coat told me my eggs were non-viable, my uterus was hostile, my chances of conception were less than 2%. I remembered the way Austin had squeezed my hand, his face arranged in an expression of sympathy that I'd believed was real. I remembered how he'd taken me to dinner afterward and told me it didn't matter, that we'd figure it out together. 2 weeks later, he'd ended our relationship. "I need a partner who can give me a family," he'd said, his voice gentle, almost kind. "You understand, don't you, Nessie? I'm not getting any younger. I need to think about my future." The ballroom had gone completely silent. Even the ambient noise from the kitchen had stopped. 200 people holding their breath, waiting to see how I would respond to this public evisceration. I felt Antonio's hand on my waist, steady and grounding, but it felt very far away. Everything felt far away except Austin's triumphant expression, and the phone he was still holding up like evidence of my worthlessness. "You see," Austin said, addressing Antonio but keeping his eyes on me. "She can't give you children. She can't give you anything. Whatever she told you to make you marry her, whatever sob story she spun, it was all manipulation. She's been lying to you from the beginning." I felt something crack inside my chest, not my heart. That had broken years ago and healed over with scar tissue. This was something deeper, the foundation of who I thought I was, the truth I'd built my identity around, that I was broken, that I was less than, that I deserved to be left. Antonio's hand left my waist, and for a horrible moment I thought he was stepping away from me. That Austin's revelation had changed something, that the man who'd bought a hotel chain to destroy my ex was now reconsidering his investment in damaged goods. But he wasn't moving away. He was reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket, the same pocket he'd pulled the ownership documents from earlier. This time, what emerged was a cream-colored envelope, thick and official-looking, with a seal embossed on the back. I recognized the logo. Hartley Women's Health Center, the most prestigious fertility clinic in the state. The kind of place that celebrities and socialites went when they wanted the best care money could buy. Antonio held the envelope out to me, his dark eyes steady on mine. "Open it," he said quietly. His voice carried through the silent ballroom, but he was speaking only to me. Read what it says." My hands shook as I took the envelope. The seal cracked under my thumb, and I pulled out several pages of medical documentation. Laboratory results, diagnostic imaging reports, a letter on official letterhead signed by Dr. Patricia Hartley herself. I scanned the pages once, not understanding. Then again. Slower, as the words began to penetrate the fog of shock and shame that had been wrapping around me. Ovarian reserve, excellent. Uterine lining, healthy and receptive. Hormone levels, within optimal range. No abnormalities detected. No impediments to natural conception. The report was dated 6 weeks ago. My name was at the top, my birth date, my medical history. This wasn't a generic report. This was about me. This was real. "I don't understand," I whispered. But even as I said it, pieces were clicking into place. The gaps in my memory from that appointment 3.5 years ago. How Austin had insisted on going with me, on speaking to the doctor privately first. How he'd been the one to relay the diagnosis, not the physician. How I'd never actually seen the full report myself, just a summary Austin had printed out at home. "Dr. Nathan Evans," Antonio said, and his voice had taken on that terrifying softness again. Licensed physician, private practice in the medical district. He owed money to some very unpleasant people. Austin paid off his gambling debts in exchange for falsified medical records. $10,000 to convince you that you were infertile. To make you feel worthless. To keep you grateful for whatever scraps of affection he threw your way. The ballroom started spinning. I gripped the papers tighter, anchoring myself to something solid. He paid a doctor to lie to me? The words came out flat, distant, like someone else was speaking. To tell me I could never have children? Antonio nodded, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. Evans lost his license 2 years ago for insurance fraud. He's currently serving 18 months in federal prison. Before he went in, he confessed to falsifying records for multiple patients. Your case was one of them. I had you examined by Dr. Hartley 6 months ago, before I even proposed to you. I needed you to know the truth before you decided whether to marry me. The results came back confirming what I already suspected. Austin had lied to you. I kept the report until tonight, until you were ready to face him. I did remember. He'd insisted I see Dr. Hartley for a full evaluation before we got serious, said it was routine for his family. I'd thought it was old-fashioned, maybe even controlling. Now I understood he'd been giving me the truth I should have had years ago. You are perfectly healthy, Vanessa, Antonio continued, and I could hear the fury burning beneath his controlled tone. You can have children. You were never broken. He made you believe you were so you'd stay small. So you'd feel lucky that he'd chosen you despite your supposed defects. The grief hit me like a physical blow. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of time stolen. 3.5 years of believing I was fundamentally damaged. 3.5 years of avoiding baby showers and looking away from pregnant women on the street and wondering what was wrong with me that I couldn't do the most basic biological function. And it had all been a lie. A calculated, purchased, deliberate lie designed to break me. I looked up from the papers. Austin had gone pale, the color draining from his face as he realized what had just been revealed. His mouth opened, trying to form words, trying to explain or justify or deny, but there was nothing he could say. The evidence was in my hands. The truth was written in medical terminology and signed by one of the best fertility specialists in the country. I stepped away from Antonio's protective presence. My legs felt weak, but they carried me forward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3, until I was standing directly in front of Austin, close enough to smell the panic sweat mixing with his expensive cologne, close enough to see the fear dawning in his eyes as he realized he'd pushed too far, revealed too much, destroyed any possibility of playing the victim in this scenario. You told me I was broken, I said, my voice quiet but steady. Around us, the crowd pressed closer, phones recording, witnesses gathering. This moment would be remembered, would be shared, would follow Austin for the rest of his life just as his lies had followed me. You made me believe there was something fundamentally wrong with me. You took away my hope of ever being a mother, and you did it to control me. Austin's mouth worked, but no sound came out. I could see him trying to calculate, trying to find the angle that would let him escape this moment, with even a shred of dignity intact. There wasn't one. I pulled my hand back, and I slapped him. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot, sharp and final and absolutely satisfying. The force of it turned Austin's head to the side, left a red mark blooming across his cheek. He stumbled backward, his hand coming up to touch his face, his eyes wide with shock. I hadn't screamed, hadn't cried, hadn't given him the emotional breakdown he'd been trying to provoke. I'd simply delivered physical proof that his words no longer had power over me, that he no longer had power over me. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Antonio was behind me again, his hand finding the small of my back. "We're done here," he said, and though he was speaking to Austin, I felt the words were meant for me too. Permission to let go, permission to walk away, permission to leave this man and his cruelty in the past where they belonged. Austin's hand was still pressed against his reddening cheek, his eyes wild with humiliation and rage. For a moment, I thought he might actually try to hit me back, his body coiled, muscles tensing, and I saw Antonio shift beside me, ready to intercept. But Austin was just smart enough to recognize that putting his hands on me in front of 200 witnesses would be the final nail in his coffin. Instead, he pivoted, did what he'd always done when cornered. He attacked the thing he thought would hurt me most. "You think you've won something here?" His voice was ragged, desperate, climbing toward hysteria. "You think marrying money makes you better than me? You're still the same pathetic woman I left, still a beggar, still drowning in debt your father left you. At least I earned everything I have. You just spread your legs for the right man." The insult was designed to cut Antonio as much as me, and I felt him go absolutely still beside me. The kind of stillness that preceded violence. But Antonio didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, he lifted his hand, a subtle gesture toward the back of the ballroom, toward the stage where a massive screen had been set up for the charity presentation. The screen that had been dark all evening suddenly flickered to life. The Grand Royal Hotel logo appeared, then dissolved into what looked like a bank statement. The numbers were large enough to read from across the room, large enough that everyone in the ballroom could see them clearly. "Her father didn't leave debt," Antonio said, his voice carrying through the space with that quiet authority that made everyone stop and listen. "Richard Morgan died 4 years ago. He was a careful man, a good man. He knew his health was failing, so he set up a trust for his daughter. $200,000, not a fortune, but enough to ensure she'd be taken care of after he was gone." The screen changed, showing another document. A trust agreement, dated 6 months before my father's death. My name was listed as the sole beneficiary. Austin's name appeared as the executor, a role my father had given him in good faith because Austin had been my boyfriend, because my father had trusted him to take care of me. "I never saw that," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. But Antonio heard me. "Because he made sure you didn't," Antonio replied. The screen shifted again, showing a series of bank transfers. Money moving from the trust account to another account, then another. Each transfer carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. The final destination was an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The account holder's name was visible in the transaction records. Austin Payne. He transferred the entire trust to his own account over a period of 6 months, Antonio continued, his voice clinical, detached, as if he were discussing stock portfolios instead of life-destroying theft. "Then he created false documentation showing your father had taken out loans before his death, loans that supposedly fell to you as his heir. He used that fabricated debt to force you to sell your family home, which he then purchased through a shell company for 1/3 of its value. He sold it 2 years later for a 400% profit." The ballroom erupted, not in shouts or chaos, but in gasps and whispered conversations, the sound of 200 wealthy people realizing they'd been rubbing shoulders with a thief. These were the kind of people who valued reputation above almost everything else, who could forgive many sins but not the sin of stealing, not the sin of being caught. I felt like I was floating, watching this unfold from somewhere outside my body. The house I'd lost, the apartment where my father died, the home where I'd grown up. I'd thought I lost it because I couldn't afford the property taxes, because there wasn't enough money left after medical bills and funeral expenses, because I was a failure who couldn't manage basic adult responsibilities. "I signed the paperwork," I said, my voice distant. "I remember signing. You told me it was to settle the estate, that there were debts I didn't know about." Austin was shaking his head frantically, backing away from me, from Antonio, from the screen that was displaying his crimes in high definition. "That's not. You can't prove. Those documents are falsified. He's manufacturing evidence to frame me." But his voice held no conviction. He knew what the truth was. We all knew. "The mortgage company still has records," Antonio said. "The bank still has records. I've spent the past 6 months reconstructing every transaction, every forged signature, every lie you told her about her father's estate. He pulled yet another folder from somewhere, this one thicker than the last. How many pieces of evidence had he compiled? How deep did his investigation go? And before you claim the signature on the trust transfer was forged, Antonio continued, I should tell you that handwriting analysis has already confirmed it was yours. The same analysis the federal prosecutor will be using when they bring charges. The word federal sent a visible shock through Austin. His face, already pale from the slap, went absolutely white. His legs seemed to give out slightly, and he grabbed the edge of a nearby table to steady himself. Around us, the donors who'd come tonight to support sick children were learning that the man who'd been soliciting their donations was a con artist, a thief, someone who'd stolen from a grieving daughter and then stolen from charity. The worst kind of criminal in their eyes. Not because the crime was the most severe, but because he'd violated their trust, had made them complicit by association. My father trusted you, I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and echoing, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well. He made you executor because he thought you'd take care of me after he died. He told me that, in the hospital, 3 days before the end. He said, Austin's a good man. He'll make sure you're all right. The memory was sharp, painful, made worse by the understanding of how thoroughly my father's trust had been betrayed. Austin had sat at my father's bedside, had held his hand, had promised to look after me. And the moment my father's eyes closed for the last time, Austin had begun systematically stealing everything he'd left behind. I loved him, Austin said suddenly, desperately, as if that mattered, as if affection could excuse theft. I loved your father. He was like family to me. But the money, it was just sitting there, and you didn't know how to manage it. You would have wasted it. I was protecting it, investing it properly. The rationalization was so absurd, so divorced from reality, that several people in the crowd actually laughed. Short, sharp sounds of disbelief. You invested it into your own account, Jordan said from somewhere behind me. She'd been so quiet I'd almost forgotten she was still there. You used Vanessa's inheritance as the down payment on your condo. The property records are public. The timeline matches perfectly. I remembered that condo. Austin had bought it 8 months after my father died. He'd told me he'd gotten a promotion, a bonus, that his hard work was finally paying off. He'd invited me to the housewarming party, where I'd stood in his kitchen eating grocery store cheese because I couldn't afford to bring a proper gift, congratulating him on his success while I was sleeping on a friend's couch because I'd lost my home to debt. The cruelty of it, the calculated nature of every lie, made my hands shake. Not with fear, with rage. Pure, clean, clarifying rage. You stole my father's legacy, I said, taking another step toward Austin. He tried to back away, but he'd run out of room. His back hit the wall, literally and figuratively. You stole my home. You made me believe I was worthless and broken and drowning. And you did it while pretending to care about me, while playing the concerned boyfriend who just couldn't handle my problems anymore. Antonio's hand found my shoulder, grounding me before the rage could consume me completely. The donors deserve to know, he said, addressing the crowd now, that the money they've given to the Angels of Mercy Fund over the past 2 years has been diverted in similar fashion. Nearly $200,000 that should have gone to children's cancer research went instead to Mr. Payne's lifestyle, his luxury car, his vacations, his wardrobe. The gasps turned to outright murmurs of anger. These people had been robbed too. Maybe not as personally as I had been, but robbed nonetheless. Their generosity, their desire to help sick children, had been exploited. Austin looked around wildly, searching for an ally, for anyone who might believe his increasingly desperate denials. He found none. Even the security guards who'd been hovering nearby had expressions of disgust. I want to leave, Austin said, his voice breaking. I'm leaving. You can't keep me here. He pushed off the wall, trying to move toward the exit. But the crowd didn't part for him the way it had parted for Antonio. If anything, people moved closer, blocking his path. Not threatening, but not allowing escape either. And then I heard them. Sirens. Multiple vehicles, growing louder. Coming closer. The sirens were getting closer, their wail cutting through the shocked murmurs and whispered conversations filling the ballroom. Austin's eyes darted toward the entrance, then back to the crowd blocking his path, panic written across every feature. But before the chaos could fully engulf us, Antonio's hand closed around my wrist, firm but gentle, and he pulled me away from the spectacle, away from Austin's impending arrest. away from the donors and their phones and their judgment, into a small alcove near the service corridor where the noise faded to a distant hum. The space was barely large enough for 2 people, shadowed and private, separated from the ballroom by a heavy velvet curtain. I could still hear everything happening on the other side. Security radios crackling, Jordan's professional voice directing people to step back, the sirens reaching their crescendo and then cutting off abruptly as vehicles arrived outside. But here, in this pocket of darkness, it was just Antonio and me. His hands came up to frame my face, tilting my head back so I had no choice but to look at him. His touch was warm, grounding, the calluses on his palms rough against my skin. "Breathe," he said again, the same word he'd whispered when he first appeared behind me tonight. I tried, pulling air into lungs that felt too tight. My mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had been revealed in the past hour. The lies about my health, the theft of my inheritance, the systematic destruction of my life by a man I'd once loved, and through it all, Antonio had known, had been watching, had been planning. How long? The question came out barely above a whisper, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to control it. "How long have you known all this?" Antonio's thumb traced along my cheekbone, a gesture so tender it seemed at odds with the violence I'd seen him capable of tonight. Not physical violence, though I didn't doubt he was capable of that too, but the violence of destroying someone's entire existence with words and evidence and calculated reveals. 3 years, he said, and the admission hung between us like a confession. I've known for 3 years. 3 years. The same amount of time I'd been clawing my way out of the pit Austin had thrown me into. The same amount of time I'd spent rebuilding myself from nothing, believing I was alone, believing no one cared whether I survived or drowned. "I don't understand," I said, though pieces were starting to click together in my mind. Puzzle pieces I hadn't known were missing. "How? Why? You didn't even know me 3 years ago." Antonio's expression shifted, something dark and possessive, moving behind his eyes. "I knew of you," he said. "Your mother needed heart surgery. Emergency bypass, 4 arteries blocked. The surgery was $300,000. She didn't have insurance. You'd already lost your house. We're working 2 jobs just to keep her in a nursing home with basic care. You were drowning." The memory hit me like a physical blow. My mother's collapse, the ambulance ride, the cardiologist explaining that without immediate surgery she had maybe 3 months to live, and the price tag that might as well have been $3 million for all the chance I had of paying it. I'd begged Austin for help, had literally gotten on my knees in his expensive condo, the one he'd bought with my father's money though I didn't know it then, and pleaded with him to co-sign a loan. He told me no, I whispered, remembering. He said he couldn't risk his credit score for something that might not even work, that I needed to be realistic about my mother's chances. "He told you no," Antonio confirmed, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that made my spine straighten. And then he went to dinner with clients and spent $800 on wine. The specificity of it, the detail, told me Antonio had been watching even then, tracking Austin's movements and expenses. "But why?" "I didn't know you," Antonio continued, answering my unspoken question. "But I knew him." Austin Payne was on my radar for different reasons. Small-time fraud, connections to people who owed me money, the kind of man who thought he was smarter than he actually was. I was having him watched when your mother got sick, when you begged him for help and he refused. Something twisted in my chest. The idea that Antonio had witnessed one of the lowest moments of my life, had seen me at my most desperate and vulnerable, should have felt like a violation, but somehow it didn't. 2 days later, Antonio said, his hands still cradling my face like I was something precious, something breakable. An anonymous donation was made to the hospital. $300,000, deposited directly into your mother's account. Enough for the surgery, and 6 months of recovery care. The room tilted. I remembered that day. Remembered the hospital administrator calling me at work, asking me to come in immediately. I'd thought they were going to tell me my mother had died. Instead, they'd told me about the donation. About the anonymous benefactor who'd paid for everything. I'd wept in that office, unable to believe such kindness existed in a world that had shown me nothing but cruelty. "That was you," I said, and it wasn't a question. Antonio nodded, his thumb continuing its gentle path along my cheekbone. "That was me. But why? You didn't know me. You had no reason to help." "I had every reason," Antonio replied, and there was something fierce in his voice now. Something that spoke to obsession and possession and feelings that went far deeper than simple charity. "I watched you fight. Watched you work yourself to exhaustion trying to save her. Watched you sacrifice everything and ask for nothing in return, and I watched him turn his back on you without a second thought. I couldn't stomach it. The confession was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. Antonio Alessandro, a man who owned half the city through legal means and controlled the other half through methods I probably didn't want to examine too closely, had seen me at my worst and decided I was worth saving. I started buying your debts. He continued, and the obsession theme was clear now, undeniable. Every credit card Austin had convinced you to open. Every loan you'd taken out trying to stay afloat. I bought them all and stopped the interest from accruing. You didn't know because I kept the collection agencies calling, kept the pressure on just enough that Austin wouldn't notice the situation improving. You bought my building, I said, remembering the conversation I'd had with my landlord 6 months ago. The rent had suddenly dropped by $200 a month. The landlord had said the new owner was implementing tenant-friendly policies. I'd been grateful but confused. I bought your building, Antonio confirmed. I bought the grocery store where you worked. I bought the coffee shop where you spent your lunch breaks. I didn't interfere, didn't make myself known, because you needed to heal on your own, needed to find your own strength. But I made sure you had a foundation that wouldn't crumble. Made sure that no matter how hard you fell, there was something to catch you. The implications were staggering. For 3 years, Antonio had been my invisible guardian, orchestrating my life from the shadows, ensuring I never truly drowned while letting me believe I was swimming on my own. It should have felt manipulative, controlling, like another man trying to manage my existence. But it didn't, because he hadn't taken away my agency, hadn't tried to swoop in and rescue me in a way that would have left me dependent. He'd simply removed the obstacles Austin had put in my path and let me rebuild myself. And tonight? I asked. All of this, the gala, the reveals, the perfect timing, you planned all of it. I planned all of it, Antonio agreed, no shame or apology in his voice. I waited until you were strong enough to stand on your own, until you didn't need saving anymore. And then I stepped in to make sure everyone knew what he'd done. To you, to others, to anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. His hand slid from my face to my shoulders, pulling me closer. I married you because I couldn't imagine my life without you in it. I destroyed him because he was in my way. The ballroom beyond our alcove erupted in fresh commotion. Authoritative voices demanding compliance. The click of handcuffs. Austin's protests rising, and then being cut off as someone read him his rights. But I barely heard it. All I could focus on was the man in front of me, this dangerous, obsessive, impossibly protective man who'd spent 3 years making sure I survived. You're terrifying, I whispered. Antonio's lips curved into the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all night. I know. I think I've loved you since the moment you paid for my mother's surgery and I didn't even know it was you. Antonio's kiss was interrupted by a crash from the ballroom, the sound of expensive crystal hitting marble, followed by Austin's voice rising to a shrill pitch. Get out of my way. You can't stop me. I'm leaving. We pulled apart, and Antonio's expression shifted from the softness he'd shown me back to the predator I'd witnessed earlier. He pulled the curtain aside just enough for us to see. Austin was trying to push through the crowd toward the service exit, his tuxedo jacket askew, his face red and blotchy with panic and rage. But the crowd wasn't cooperating. The donors who'd fawned over him an hour ago were blocking his path, not aggressively, but not moving aside either. Then the main doors burst open. Not local police in their standard uniforms, but federal agents in dark suits with FBI emblazoned across their tactical vests, at least a dozen of them, moving with military precision, spreading through the ballroom in a coordinated pattern that spoke of planning and preparation. FBI, nobody move. The command echoed through the space, and the ballroom froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones that had been recording lowered slightly, though not entirely. This was a story people would tell for years. The night Austin Payne was arrested at his own charity gala. Austin Payne, the lead agent called out. A woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair, and an expression that suggested she'd seen every con and excuse the world had to offer. You're under arrest for wire fraud, charity fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Austin's face went from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. I didn't do anything. This is a setup. That man, he pointed wildly in Antonio's direction. He's framing me. He's the criminal. He runs the mafia. The accusation was desperate. The last attempt of a drowning man to pull someone else under with him. The FBI agent didn't even glance at Antonio. Mr. Payne, approximately 7 minutes ago, You attempted to wire $437,000 from the Angels of Mercy charity account to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. That transfer was flagged and frozen. The account you were wiring to matches the account we've been monitoring in connection with your ongoing embezzlement." She pulled out handcuffs, the metallic click loud in the silent ballroom. "Every transaction you made tonight was tracked. Every donor payment, every credit card swipe. You're done." Jordan appeared from the crowd, holding a tablet. "The transfer was initiated from his phone at 9:42 p.m., she said, showing the screen to the agent. "Full documentation of his access codes and authorization signatures. He did it from the men's restroom, probably thinking the charity presentation on stage would distract everyone." The agent nodded, taking the tablet. 2 other agents moved in, flanking Austin, who'd gone completely still. Shock maybe, or the final realization that there was no talking his way out of this. The handcuffs went on with practiced efficiency, clicking shut around his wrists with a finality that echoed through my chest. "Help me," Austin screamed, looking at the crowd that had once admired him. "Someone help me! This is illegal! They can't do this!" But the donors turned away, literally turned their backs on him, resuming their conversations, checking their phones, pretending the man being arrested in the center of the ballroom didn't exist. He'd stolen from charity. He'd stolen from them. There was no coming back from that in their world. Antonio's hand found the small of my back, warm and grounding. "Time to go," he murmured. He shrugged out of his suit jacket and draped it over my shoulders. The fabric still held his body heat, smelled like sandalwood and leather and safety. He guided me through the crowd, which parted for us the way it had parted for him earlier. The same primal recognition that said not to get in his way. We passed Austin being read his Miranda rights, past Jordan handing over her files to the FBI, past the donors already spinning this story in their minds, deciding how they'd tell it tomorrow over brunch and business meetings. The cool night air hit us as we stepped outside. Police cars and black FBI vehicles lined the circular drive, their lights painting everything in red and blue. Officers were setting up barriers, keeping back the handful of pedestrians who'd stopped to watch. Antonio's car was waiting, a sleek black SUV with windows so dark I couldn't see inside. A man in a driver's uniform opened the back door, his expression professionally blank. Antonio helped me inside, his hand on my elbow, and then slid in beside me. The door closed, cutting off the chaos outside, and suddenly everything was quiet. The partition between us and the driver was already up, giving us complete privacy. Bulletproof glass, I realized, noting the thickness of the windows, reinforced doors. This wasn't just a luxury vehicle. This was armor. The car pulled away from the hotel, gliding smoothly past the police barricades and news vans that were just starting to arrive. I watched the Grand Royal Hotel recede in the side mirror, its elegant facade still lit by crystal chandeliers inside, still hosting the gala as if nothing catastrophic had just occurred. Maybe to some people, nothing had. The charity would get its money. The FBI would get its conviction. Life would go on. But for me, everything had changed. I looked down at my left hand, at the ring that had marked me as belonging to someone dangerous and powerful. The diamond caught the streetlights as we drove, flashing like a beacon, like a warning, like a promise. I looked at Antonio, really looked at him. The tattoos crawling up his neck, visible now in the dim interior light. The scar on his jaw, the hands that could destroy a man's life with a phone call but had touched my face with impossible gentleness. He was watching me, patient, waiting for whatever I needed to say, or do, or ask. "Is it over?" The question came out smaller than I'd intended, vulnerable in a way I hadn't been all night. Antonio's hand covered mine, his palm warm, the skull tattoo on his knuckles stark against my pale skin. "His life is over," he said, his voice certain and final. "Ours is just beginning." The simplicity of it, the absolute conviction, made something in my chest loosen. I wasn't a victim anymore, wasn't defined by what had been taken from me, or the lies I'd been told. I was someone who'd survived, who'd been protected by shadows I didn't know existed, who'd married a man as terrifying as he was devoted. I leaned into Antonio's side, letting my head rest on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him beneath expensive fabric. His arm came around me, pulling me closer, his hand still covering mine. The ring glinted in the passing streetlights, over and over, as we drove through the city toward whatever future we were building together. Thank you for sharing this story with me today. If this tale resonated with you, please help our community grow by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. And I truly want to hear from you. What's the one thought this story left you with? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay gentle and stay grateful.